We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of which we record this podcast, the Whadjuk people of Nungabudja. We recognise their continued connection to the land and waters of this beautiful place and acknowledge that this land has never been ceded.
Step into the realm of daring ideas and transformative dialogues. This is Voices from the Edge, the podcast that pushes boundaries and ventures beyond the ordinary. Here, we confront the crucial issues that shape our world today. From the heartbeat of community challenges to the untold chronicles of leadership. From the relentless pursuit of social justice to the essential lessons in safety and lifelong learning. Voices from the Edge takes you to the crossroads of change. Because the edge is not just a boundary, it's where growth happens. It's where the real conversations begin. So lean in, be inspired, and let's explore what lies beyond the edge.
And joining us today is the marvellous and wonderful Sean Brady. Sean, how are you?
Dr. Sean Brady is a forensic engineer who investigates engineering failures from a technical and organizational perspective. In 2020, he completed the Brady Review, an investigation into the causes of fatalities in the Queensland mining industry. The review was tabled in Parliament and made 11 recommendations to the regulator and mining companies on how to improve safety. In 2024, he completed the technical and organizational investigation into the catastrophic failure of a turbine generator at Callide C Power Station in Queensland, Australia. He also speaks, writes, and podcasts on the causes of technical and organizational failure.
Very good. Good to be here, Tom.
Where are you joining us from this morning, Sean?
I'm based in Brisbane here. We're in the city.
Oh, fantastic. And we've got the Battle of the Bookcases and Battle of the Plants going in the background there. Well done.
We have yet to get our logo up yet. We're going to get our logo on the back wall, but that's in the planning stage at the moment rather than the final stages.
There was a few people who said should have got one of those big, I don't know, banners. And I'm just like, what banner for what though? I mean, seriously. It's not like I represent anything. Oh, we shouldn't have said that maybe. All right, Sean, you're a forensic engineer. First of all, what does that do? What does a forensic engineer do?
Yeah, so I started off sort of specializing in that about 16, 17 years ago. So I'm an engineer by training, structural engineer. Never was particularly interested in design and going out and designing new things. I was much more interested in how things work. Because design is a lot about following a cookbook that produces a certain structure in structural engineering anyway. I was much more interested in how things actually work. So a lot of my early career after I was an academic was really looking at how structures work in the real world. We did a lot of work on bridges in Australia where we'd actually go out and we'd put sensors on the bridges and we'd measure how they were actually bending and how far they were deflecting and all that sort of stuff. So you really, I suppose my technical area became an understanding how structures work in real life. And that sort of naturally leads you to forensic engineering, which is all about trying to identify why a structure failed if you're in the structural side of things. And what's really interesting about that is that we sort of build defective structures all the time from a compliance perspective, that they don't comply perfectly with the code. But that doesn't mean we actually get failures or defects. That's something that only comes up when you get these sort of perfect storm of events and things going wrong. So forensics is all about working out what actually contributed on the day to the failure. And we did that for a long time, mostly for law firms who were trying to understand why things had gone wrong. And of course, they were in the business of assigning blame. But our job was always to actually just get to the issue, understand what contributed, get all the irrelevant stuff off the table and out of consideration, and just focus on this is what actually contributed on the day to cause the failure. So that's pretty much what a forensic engineer does, is just that very niche piece of it.
Okay. How did you go about transitioning from being an engineer that looked at structures into doing the investigations about failures after events?
So what's really interesting when you start looking at structural engineering failures particularly is that we keep repeating the same technical causes of failure over and over again. We pretty much haven't discovered a new technical cause of failure since about the 1940s. And what that really means is that everything we've knocked down since the 1940s, we technically knew and understood what the issues were. We knew how to manage them, all of those things. So then you start to say, well, hang on, how are we still knocking things down if we have, supposedly technically perfected this sort of thing? And what you find is that there's a whole bunch of organizational factors that sit behind these technical factors that actually cause the failure. So I got really interested in those organizational factors. And that was interesting at the time because we as structural engineers were kind of have a view, and I think engineers in general have this view, that non-rational thinking is for other people. Engineers are brilliantly rational people. We're not subject to biases. None of those things are a problem for us. We're just really rational. But of course, what you find is we're human just like everyone else, and we work inside organizations like everyone else. So what actually happens is we are subject to the same organizational causes of failure as everyone else too. And the fascinating thing about those organizational causes is that they're not unique to engineering. They're pretty much the same, across the board. The reason why we knock structures down is the same reason why we kill patients in operating theaters and businesses go bust and all those sorts of issues, because people are the same, the organizations are largely the same as well. So we should expect the causes of these failures to be similar. So I got into that, started to present a lot about that stuff, and I suppose what happened was over the years, originally it started off with here's a technical failure and here's the organizational cause, a little bit of organizational cause. By the end of about 3 or 4 years, there was a tiny bit of engineering and the rest of it was all about the organizational cause. And that sort of naturally then led me out of this, this world of just pure engineering to looking at fatalities and major incidents in general.
Okay, excellent. Now, just to, you mentioned working and helping lawyers understand what went wrong. Just curious, the legalistic nature of prosecutions after something goes wrong, is it just natural that we end up looking for a party or a person to blame for what actually happened?
I think there's a couple of things going on. I think we humans love blame. We love to be able to point at someone and say that's the cause. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about this conflict between learning and blame and how those two are not happy bedfellows at all. But I think the whole system is sort of set up, particularly in the construction industry, is set up to actually do that, which is where my expert witness work would have largely been focused. The way we set up contracts is very adversarial. We try and transfer risk between parties. It all gets very messy. And when things go wrong, they tend to go wrong pretty badly, and there's a lot of money at stake. So that there has to be some sort of mechanism afterwards for trying to figure out what went wrong, who caused it, and how do you try and remedy that. But it does not exactly produce an environment that's good from learning for why these disasters happened. And that's why a lot of the presentations I do are of famous failures, because that information is in the public domain. Most of the stuff you investigate as a forensic engineer, it never goes to court. It settles. There's lots of confidentiality around that settlement. So it's really hard to talk about some of the lessons from the actual work. Tom, you froze there, so I'm not sure.
Oh, that's good.
If you asked the question.
Yeah, it's good. I'll edit this bit out because I was like, I've learned over the time when people freeze not to interrupt, because it makes an interesting thing. So you were telling us about our the lovely bit about when you talk about public figures. I don't know. Shall we do that again?
Happy to do that again. Yeah. Ask your question again, and we'll have another go at it.
Okay. Okay. Is in the current situation where we have engineering failures or we have failures which cost people's lives, is the legal system and the adversarial nature of the courts basically set up for us to actually look for someone to blame?
I think it's human nature, and I think when it comes to, if I talk about construction projects, particularly from a technical engineering expert issue, what you see is that the contracts that are set up to deliver those projects are adversarial in nature, and people are trying to push risk to a different party to manage that risk. They're trying to get lump sums on things. They're trying to get certainty on things, and particularly in an environment which is really, really hard to get certainty on it. So you end up with contracts that really produce a situation that if something goes wrong and people lose a lot of money, there is this process where they're trying to work through it to understand exactly who is responsible for each of those pieces, and that can get incredibly complex and incredibly messy trying to sort those sorts of things out.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Early on, moreover, let's think about your whole time as a forensic engineer. What's one investigation that stands out to you as being particularly significant?
Of my own, I can't talk about those, but certainly can talk about some of the really famous ones that have been really, really important. There's a couple of ones that really stands out. There's the collapse of the Minneapolis bridge, killed 13 people. And what's really interesting about it is it's in the US. It's a 40-year-old bridge. It's been around since 1968. You get 40 years later at 6 o'clock in the evening, rush hour traffic, bridge collapses, drops over 100 cars in the river. And it's really interesting for a couple of things. One, the bridge had actually a design defect in it for over 40 years, but had been fine. So it's a really good example of how much conservatism that we build into these structures. And what actually tipped it over the edge was that there was a contractor doing work on the bridge at the time. They were removing what we call the wearing course, which is sort of 50 millimeters of sacrificial concrete you put on top of a bridge. So, and it basically gets worn. And when it gets worn too much, you go in and replace it. This contractor was going across the bridge replacing sections, and they've been working on it for months. Problem was that they had a narrow window between where they mixed the concrete and they actually placed the concrete in its final position. When they were on the edge of the bridge or near the approach spans on this bridge, they were doing everything in a little yard beside the bridge, and they had plenty of time to get the concrete up and into place. But when they got out near the center of the bridge, and this is a 0.5 kilometer long bridge when you add up all the spans, the contractor worked out it'd take too long to get the concrete up and onto the bridge and into position. So what they actually did was they decided, well, why don't I just mix the concrete on the bridge? Of course, to do that, you got to put on the sand and the gravel on the bridge to actually do that. There's a long, very, very interesting story about how they got approval to do this, but they went ahead and did this, and they basically put 4 times the load that the bridge was actually designed for on the bridge. And what's interesting is it was that loading in combination with the design defect that collapsed the bridge. If the design defect hadn't been there, it would have survived or likely survived this incredible loading. So it's a really interesting failure from the sense that we can have lots of latent issues in our systems and they just sit around waiting for the right sort of trigger to initiate a full collapse or a full failure. The other one that I speak a lot about is the Florida International University Bridge, which collapsed quite recently. And it's a really interesting one. It was investigated by the National Transportation Safety Board. And one of the members on that board said in the report, they said, how in this day and age in the US are we still collapsing structures? The science is sorted. We know how to do this. How are we in a situation where this sort of thing can happen? And what you basically find out in this failure is that it's got a huge number of the organizational factors that we talk about in other failures. One, the bridge ends up cracking really, really badly over the course of its 3 weeks life before it actually collapsed. And it collapsed on a roadway below, killed a worker, killed 5 people in the vehicles below. This cracking had started 3 weeks before the actual failure. And the cracks grew and grew and grew, and they are horrendous looking cracks. And it's a really interesting story about, why did no one stop the work? Why did no one stop the work and say there's something seriously wrong with this bridge? And they just basically let the work continue till the actual bridge collapsed. And we see this in particularly in construction a lot, where the cost of stopping work is massive. And it's really difficult for people to actually go, no, we're stopping this work. It's much easier to let the work continue. The other thing about this project, which is a really interesting one, is that one of the really contributing parts of it was the interactions between the parties who actually designed and built the bridge. There was cost pressures in there, and there's a really great example of how those cost pressures essentially produced a situation where the designers, or the people who were doing a check of the design of the bridge, didn't check all the connections in the bridge. And it turns out that there was a very significant design error on one of the connections, and that's ultimately what collapsed the bridge. So what you see in these two failures, which I find really interesting, is these organizational factors are really significant, and technically there was nothing in those two failures that we didn't know or understand as a profession of engineers.
Yeah. Are you seeing the same common patterns occurring and recurring in different types of failures or disasters that actually occur?
Oh yeah. You see the same. Technically, they're quite different, but you see the same organizational factors over and over again. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a bridge failure, some of the stuff I've investigated, or you're talking about NASA's Challenger disaster. At the end of the day, we're all humans, and our organizations are very similarly put together. And you see the drift into failure very regularly. You see normalization of deviance very regularly. You see people not stopping work very, very regularly, because the consequences of stopping work is usually very evident to people, whereas the failure that's about to happen, they can't even imagine it because it's so catastrophic. So we see these same patterns just coming up again and again, and it doesn't matter really whether it's in individual fatalities, or in big stuff, as I said, like NASA, and we always see the warning signs. The warning signs are always there, and they're always missed in terms of their significance.
Is it a case that when you say the warning signs are always there and they're evident, and you talked about people see the costs of stopping work, etc., and they don't see the costs of, I don't know, the failure, disaster, it's not as evident because we've done this. Is it a case of 2020 vision in hindsight that you can see all the things that you can see clearly where we should have stopped work? These were the signs and that, but at the time we don't know the disaster is going to happen, so we just keep heading towards it until inevitably it does happen.
Yeah, I mean, you got to be really careful of the hindsight bias, don't you, in these things? I think what we see is people pay, if we be very simplistic about this, people pay attention to the stuff that's going wrong around them, and if we go to health and safety, the classic thing is they're looking at the TRIFR or the LTIFR or whatever. They're looking at the slips, trips and falls and the hand injuries, and they're focusing on those things. But then we get a fatality and we say, well, where did this come from? And what you discover when you get a fatality, or what certainly we found when we did the review into fatalities in Queensland, was that the controls that should have been in place weren't working for a long time. Or they weren't, the several controls weren't there. It's obvious they weren't working for a long time. And the significance of that is just missed. When bad things go wrong, fatalities, when things blow up, explosions, all that sort of stuff, what you see is that you see these near misses where kind of all the ingredients were necessary, that were necessary to have a failure were there, but good luck intervened to actually prevent a bad one. In other words, the system weaknesses are there, and the warning signs are the signals we get to say our system is weaker than we think it is. But of course, because the bad thing hasn't happened yet, we really miss the significance of that. So I think a lot of it is people are getting distracted by the stuff that's happening in the here and now, but they're not asking themselves, if things go badly wrong here, what does this actually look like?
Yeah. Do you have any strategies for when we do investigations, how to overcome our inherent biases?
Yeah, I mean, but if we pull back a bit, I mean, my view is every investigation you do that the key thing it should do is identify what controls failed, what controls should have been there that weren't there, and then why were they not there, or why were they ineffective. What we know from our review and the international research is that people die when controls that the organization believed were in place were ineffective. That's the key thing. So therefore, investigations should tell us where are our controls ineffective, because then we get the opportunity to do something about that before anything bad happens. So I think that's the key. I think too quickly we default, we default, and it's almost stereotypical, but we default to the thing of, well, who didn't follow the system? Who didn't follow the procedure? That person didn't follow the procedure. Let's blame that person and send a message that if you follow the procedure, everything's going to be okay. But what we see in the research is that when people aren't following the procedure, they're usually not the only people not following the procedure. Usually that's how work is actually done inside the organization. And there's a whole variety of reasons why procedures don't get followed. I think if you're ever getting in a report that says that the worker isn't following the procedure and the investigation ends there, that's a terrible investigation. I think it's Hopkins who says that human error should be the starting point of the investigation, not the end point. So for me, the investigations have to really focus on what are the controls we thought were there and why were they ineffective on the day. The other thing, though, that I think is absolutely key is we have to be very careful that we actually investigate the right events. And I don't think we do enough for this. So if we go back to the concept that, we typically get near misses before a major event, like a fatality or a big explosion. Well, what that means is that those events need to be investigated, but those events are typically not investigated because what actually happens is someone looks at it and and goes, well, nothing bad happened. That's proof the system actually works. And then what we do is we spend our times investigating the slips, the trips, and the falls. And the key thing here is that the things that kill you are not the same as the things that hurt you. The controls that prevent you dying are not the same controls that prevent the minor injuries. So if we're only investigating the stuff around the minor injuries and the actual events that are happening where we get an actual negative impact, you're not actually getting information on the controls that will actually prevent someone from dying in your organization. So 2 things: investigate with a view to understanding which controls are failing, and make sure you investigate the incidents that are giving you the most valuable information on where your control ineffectivenesses are. And that's really about saying, what are your low likelihood, high consequence events? Did this event, which nothing bad happened in, is this a low likelihood, high consequence event? And if it is, you should investigate it and understand why the controls you thought were there are not working as well as they should.
Yeah, excellent. Speaking of the review you did into Queensland mines and quarries, you mentioned there that there seemed to be a fatality cycle that wasn't addressed, and it was, for me, it's we have a series of fatalities quite regularly, and then we have nothing, and then if we don't do anything, it happens all over again. And you made 11 recommendations to, address the situation. How happy are you that those recommendations have been addressed?
That's a good question. I think if we go to one of the main let's go to 2 of the main recommendations. One is about controls, and the other is about high reliability organizations. In Queensland, we're now moving to a critical control approach to managing fatality risk, and a lot of companies are moving to a critical control approach. I'm a big fan of the critical control approach when it's done properly. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be not done properly in many cases, and what I mean by that is people will you descend into another layer of audit. In other words, we say, oh, we've got all this paperwork for checking our systems, and now we're going to put another level of paperwork which is going to focus on these critical controls. And the assumption in there is that if the control is in place, that it's also effective. Now, we know that there's a big difference between control being in place and control being effective. In other words, you can be compliant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's effective. So at its worst, critical control approach and focusing on controls is going to descend into another layer of paperwork and audit. So I think that we have to be really, really careful about here, because that key recommendation is all about making sure your controls are effective. The second one is the high reliability organizations. And I would say that really the industry hasn't got its head around this at all. And I would say, when I wrote that, I didn't expect it was going to cause as much confusion among people as it did. But at its heart, there are organizations out there called high reliability organizations. Commercial airlines are one of them. These are organizations that work in incredibly hazardous environments, yet have very few incidents. Like, we genuinely feel that flying is incredibly safe. But if you think about it for 5 minutes, it's crazy. You're climbing into an aluminium tube with 200 other people and flying up in the sky, and there's going to be loads of other tubes full of people up there too. And yet we have a tiny, tiny, tiny number of incidents. So it's incredibly safe. And how do they do it? Well, they don't do it by doing the same as the rest of us do. They don't do compliance harder. What I think most in the mining industry do, they say, look, to be safe, what you need is a system for keeping people safe, and then we enforce compliance on that system. We make people comply with the system. But the assumption being that if we do that, then we'll be safe. And of course, when we find that someone, when there is an incident, what we'll do is we'll find out where someone didn't follow the system, and that must be the cause. But high reliability organizations, compliance is a huge part of it. Don't get me wrong on that. But they understand you can't design the perfect system. And what they do is they put the practices in place that allow them to understand where the system they've designed is weak, where the controls, if we want to put it in that language, are not as effective as they should be. And then they act on that information to make those controls more effective. Now, the practices they put in place to do that are, we could spend quite a bit of time on that, but there are things like understanding how work is really done versus how the procedures are saying it's done. It's about understanding that you do want incident reports and high potential incident reports, particularly, because they're really valuable sources of information on where your system is weak. But you've got to embed those practices, because bad news naturally doesn't flow upwards inside organizations. Now, has the industry as a whole in mining embraced that sort of concept? I would say absolutely not. From talking to people at conferences, everyone up to that executive level, and there's a few exceptions at executive level, but everyone up to that executive level, they know what to do. They know where the system is weak. They know where it's just paperwork rubbish. They know all of those things. But executive and board levels, as I said, with some exceptions, still genuinely believe you can prevent fatalities by having a system and making people comply with it. And I think this is where critical controls and high reliability come together really, really well. If you treat a critical control program as much more than a compliance program, if you treat it as a learning program, where when you're doing checks and controls, you're trying to learn about whether they're effective as opposed to just compliant, that's where I think the magic really happens, because you're now having meaningful conversations with your people, and you're getting meaningful information on whether those controls are actually effective rather than just compliance. And I think that's where the real bang for buck is. We know that if you want to stop fatalities, control effectiveness is the key thing. A critical control program helps you identify, decide, and focus on those critical controls. And if you've got a HRO mindset, one that's aimed about learning about where your system's weak and doing something about that, then focusing on those critical controls becomes really, really powerful in terms of making your system stronger. But we're a long way from that place at the moment, Tom.
Yeah, I can understand that. All right. Groupthink and organisational overconfidence. How big a role do they play in some of the disastrous incidents you've investigated?
Yeah, we see a lot of groupthink. We see a hell of a lot of groupthink. And everyone wants other people to tell them everything's going to be okay, and then you want to believe everything's going to be okay. And again, if we go back to high reliability organizations, one of their 5 characteristics that's so important is called chronic unease, and it's one of the ones that's really quite, people's understanding of this is pretty poor. They sort of say, well, if we want chronic unease in our organization, I need to tell the front line to have more chronic unease, be more concerned. You're in a very hazardous environment. And that's not what chronic unease is at all. Chronic unease it's an organizational level concept. It's a system concept. And what it basically says is a healthy skepticism about how well things are working. And particularly when things are going well. And I think what we see in health and safety is there's a sort of a view that unless we're getting bad news, the system must be working. And of course, high reliability organizations are the opposite. They're constantly looking for where their system's not working as well as they think it is. They're actually looking for that. They're receptive to that information. They've put in, as we said before, the practices to make sure that information flows up to them. That's the antidote to groupthink, is to be able to look at that information and use it to make your system stronger. But you do have to push against groupthink to be able to do that. And there's a wonderful example which really shows how groupthink can get out of hand. And we see this in major bridge failures. I think it is a bridge engineer's trait. And it's called, basically, what's it called? It's fundamentally about if you hire someone who's technically brilliant, right, to manage a bridge job or to manage anything, then if that person decides everything's okay, even if there's warning signs to say probably things aren't okay here, people will tend to default to that expert's view. They will tend to go, oh, well, they think it's okay, it must be okay. And we see this particularly in major bridge failures, where you get this, absolutely crack-hot bridge engineer in charge, and as long as he, and it's usually he, says everything is okay, even though other people are concerned, they will always get silenced. Because if it's good enough for that person, it must be good enough for everyone else too. So yeah, groupthink, massive problem. And again, you can summarize this all down to, how do you make warning signs vivid and allow a rational discussion about them and what they mean in terms of managing your risk moving forward?
Good. High risk organizations, I've got one word for you: Boeing.
Yes, Boeing is an incredible story, and I've been talking about this quite a while. It's a wonderful example of how you set up a company in the beginning. So I think they began in 1916. Always a focus on building great aircraft. Sort of philosophy of, if you build great aircraft, you'll make money. Engineers are, encouraged to demand what they want in their planes. There's a story I love where the engineers are not told the price of anything. So when they're choosing between competing parts to put in an aircraft, basically what happened was they were not shown the price. They were just told to pick the one that will make the aircraft the safest. And they even had a line in Boeing that said, "We hire engineers and other people." But then what happened was Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, and they were a completely different type of firm. So I think this was late 90s, maybe 97. And they were totally focused on cost cutting, return on shareholder investment, all that sort of stuff. And you put those two cultures together, and who do you think wins? The geeky engineers trying to build the safer planes, or the real business savvy, money savvy people? And really, what happened was their culture just dramatically changed, and it changed to away from an engineering focus to one on return on shareholder value, cost cutting, all that sort of stuff. A wonderful physical example of how it manifested. They were always a Seattle company, and then they made an announcement that the executive team was going to move. And they were eventually relocated to Chicago, and engineering was kept and manufacturing was kept in Seattle. And the reason given was that the engineers were having too much undue influence over the executives. So it should be they were expected to be making financial decisions, business decisions, and the engineers were having too much influence on them. And I think that's when you realize culturally your transition is probably quite complete in terms of what you focus on. And the story that I've spent a lot of time looking at is the 737 MAX 8 crashes. And it really is an example of how you put engineering second, and slowly you end up making a whole series of decisions that produce a plane that had significant vulnerabilities due to its software system MCAS when it was first released.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, last question for the day, Sean. If you had one message or one key message for leaders of organisations who may be listening, what would it be?
I think the key one is most companies are in the mindset the only way you keep people safe is you design a good system to keep them safe. You police that system so they follow it. You keep an eye on your TRIF or your LTIFR, and as long as that's low, you must be doing something right. And I would say that belief is the single most misguided belief with regard to health and safety in a lot of the companies we deal with. And the place where you need to shift your head to is what hurts you doesn't kill you. So the causes and therefore the controls of these incidents that actually cause fatalities and big bad outcomes, they're different from the slips, trips, and falls. So the information inside the TRIFR or your LTIFR is meaningless when it comes to the management of your major risk or your fatality risk. And your key is to understand that you should try and build a perfect system to keep your people safe. And you should make sure people comply with that. But you should understand that system will drift. It will not be able to keep your people 100% safe. And what you need to do is to then embed in your organization the practices that will allow the information that you need, the information on where your system isn't as effective as you think it is, particularly your controls and your critical controls. You need to embed the practices that get that information flowing to you, and then you need to act on that information. That this is a well-trodden path for organizations who have moved beyond this traditional compliance, or it's sometimes called a calculative-based approach to the management of safety. Compliance will always play a key role in there, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep the compliance that actually makes the system more effective, and learn and make it better from what you learn. That's the key message.
Beautiful. Sean Brady, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today, but for now we'll have to leave it there.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks for listening to Voices from the Edge. If you like what we are doing, like the episode in the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss any future episodes, and leave a positive review.